Have you ever wondered what happens when law becomes meaningless? When badges hold no power and courts fear to convene? Deep in the hollers and ridges of Kentucky, where mist clings to mountainsides like secrets, certain family names carried weight that made grown men cross the street. These weren't just tough folks scraping by in hard times. These were dynasties built on blood, fear, and a twisted understanding that might makes right. Today, we're venturing into the darkest corners of Kentucky's hidden history, exploring 10 families whose reigns of terror stretched across generations. Families so dangerous that their very existence rewrote the rules of how justice worked in America's forgotten places. So before you take comfortable, take a minute to like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time it is for you. The Commonwealth of Kentucky has always been a place where isolation breeds its own kind of law, where federal marshals feared to tread and state troopers traveled in groups of 6 or more. In these remote hollows, family bloodlines determined everything. Your surname could mean protection, or it could mean a death sentence. And for over a century, 10 particular clans turned entire regions into their personal kingdoms of terror. 1. The Cornett Dynasty. In the coal-rich mountains of eastern Kentucky, the Cornett name became synonymous with swift and brutal justice. Led by patriarch Elias Cornett in the 1880s, this family controlled mining operations through a combination of intimidation, strategic violence, and an uncanny ability to make problems disappear permanently. What made the Cornetts particularly feared was their methodical approach to revenge. Cross one Cornett, and you'd spend the rest of your shortened life looking over your shoulder. Their most notorious incident occurred in 1889 when a rival mining foreman attempted to unionize workers at a Cornett operation. The foreman, Thomas Mitchell, was found 3 days later at the bottom of a mine shaft, his body bearing injuries that mining accidents simply couldn't explain. When state investigators arrived, they discovered that every witness had either fled the county or suddenly developed severe memory problems. The Cornetts had perfected the art of collective amnesia, but their true genius lay in recruitment. They didn't just terrorize communities, they absorbed them. Young men with few prospects found themselves drawn into the Cornett operation, starting as lookouts and advancing through increasingly violent initiations. By 1900, the family controlled not just mines, but also the general stores, the postal routes, and even the circuit judge who mysteriously ruled in their favor time after time. The Cornetts maintained power through what locals called the accounting system. Every favor granted, every debt owed, every slight endured was meticulously recorded in ledgers that read like prophetic death lists. Payment always came due, sometimes years later, sometimes passed down to the next generation. Sons inherited their father's debts, and the Cornett memory stretched back decades. 2. The Fugates of Troublesome Creek. While most Kentucky mountain families ruled through fear and violence, the Fugates wielded a different kind of power that proved equally terrifying. Known throughout the region for their distinctive blue-tinged skin caused by a rare genetic condition, the Fugates turned their unusual appearance into psychological warfare that lasted over a century. Led by the enigmatic Zachariah Fugate, who arrived in the area in 1820, the family established themselves in the most isolated reaches of Hazard County. Their blue skin, caused by methemoglobinemia, made them instantly recognizable and fueled wild rumors about supernatural abilities. Zachariah encouraged these whispers, claiming his family possessed the sight and could commune with spirits that dwelled in the deeper caves. What started as harmless mountain superstition evolved into something far more sinister as the Fugates realized the power their reputation granted them. When disputes arose, both parties would seek Fugate arbitration, believing the family's unusual appearance indicated divine favor. Zachariah's word became law in 3 counties, and his judgments were swift and permanent. The family's most disturbing practice involved their treatment of outsiders who ventured too deep into Fugate territory. Travelers reported encounters with blue-skinned figures who would appear silently on mountain paths, speaking in riddles and demanding tribute for safe passage. Those who refused often found themselves hopelessly lost, wandering in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion. By the 1920s, the Fugates had evolved their methods. Rather than relying solely on superstition, they had built an extensive network of informants throughout eastern Kentucky. Their unusual appearance made them memorable, but their intelligence network made them omnipresent. They knew who owed money, who was cheating on their spouse, who had stolen livestock. This information became currency, and the Fugates traded in secrets like other families traded in coal. 3. The Stumbo Empire. Perhaps no family better understood the intersection of violence and politics than the Stumbos of Floyd County. Beginning with patriarch Isaiah Stumbo in the 1860s, this clan realized that controlling elections meant controlling everything else. Their rise to power coincided with the post-Civil War chaos, when traditional authority structures had collapsed and new ones were being written in blood. Isaiah's innovation was simple but effective. He offered protection to anyone willing to vote the Stumbo ticket. This protection came with a price, paid not in money, but in absolute loyalty. Cross the Stumbos after accepting their protection, and you discover just how far their reach extended. Their political machine operated like a feudal system, with the Stumbo patriarch as lord and registered voters as vassals. The family's control extended far beyond elections. They appointed sheriffs, influenced judges, and even had representatives in the state legislature who owed their positions entirely to Stumbo backing. By the 1890s, they had effectively created a shadow government that operated parallel to official Kentucky authority. Their enforcement methods were legendary for their creativity. Rather than simply eliminating enemies, the Stumbos preferred to destroy them slowly and publicly. Business licenses would mysteriously expire, tax assessments would skyrocket, and suddenly every government office would discover violations that required the immediate attention. They had weaponized bureaucracy decades before anyone had a name for it. The Stumbo political machine survived well into the 20th century, adapting to changing times while maintaining its core philosophy. Power flows from the willingness to use it without restraint. Even today, political observers in eastern Kentucky speak carefully when discussing certain electoral patterns that seem to defy statistical probability. 4. The Branham blood feuds. In the annals of Kentucky mountain violence, few families matched the Branhams for sheer sustained brutality. Unlike other clans who built criminal enterprises or political machines, the Branhams seemed to exist solely for the purpose of warfare. Beginning with the legendary Jeremiah Branham in the 1870s, this family turned feuding into an art form that claimed hundreds of lives across 4 generations. Jeremiah's philosophy was elegantly simple. Honor demanded blood, and blood demanded more blood. What started as a dispute over timber rights in 1854 evolved into a multi-generational conflict that engulfed entire communities. The Branhams didn't just fight their enemies, they fought their enemies' families, their business partners, their neighbors, and anyone who had ever shared a meal with them. Their signature tactic was the anniversary raid. Every year on the date of a significant Branham death, the family would launch coordinated attacks against anyone connected to their enemies. These raids were planned months in advance, with family members traveling from distant states to participate in what they called Justice Day. The psychological impact was devastating, as entire communities lived in fear of calendar dates that might mark their doom. The Branham compound in Knott County resembled a military installation more than a family homestead. Watchtowers provided clear sight lines down mountain approaches. Underground tunnels connected buildings for safe movement during attacks, and weapon caches were distributed throughout the property. They had transformed their ancestral land into a fortress designed for perpetual war. What made the Branhams particularly dangerous was their recruitment strategy. They actively sought out young men who had been wronged by their enemies, offering them family membership in exchange for participation in raids. These adopted Branhams often proved more vicious than blood relatives, desperate to prove their worthiness for inclusion in the clan. 5. The Maggard Territory. Deep in the mountains of Harlan County, the Maggard family established what amounted to a sovereign nation within Kentucky's borders. Led by the calculating Solomon Maggard in the 1880s, they realized that controlling geography meant controlling everything that moved through it. The Maggards didn't just own land, they owned every path, stream, and ridgeline for miles in every direction. Their innovation was the toll system. Anyone crossing Maggard territory paid a fee, whether they were traveling on foot, horseback, or wagon. Refusal to pay meant travelers found themselves facing armed men who emerged from the forest like phantoms. But the Maggards were business people first and killers second. Most disputes could be resolved through negotiation, provided visitors understood that negotiation meant accepting Maggard terms. The family's true genius lay in their understanding of information as currency. Every traveler who paid the toll was questioned about their origin, destination, and purpose. Over decades, the Maggards assembled detailed intelligence about commerce, politics, and personal relationships across multiple states. They knew who was moving money, who was running from the law, and who had secrets worth protecting. This intelligence network transformed them from simple mountain bandits into brokers of power. Politicians sought Maggard support for elections. Businessmen paid for information about competitors, and fugitives purchased safe passage to distant states. The family had monetized their reputation for violence while rarely needing to actually employ it. The Maggard compound featured what locals called the accounting house, where Solomon maintained detailed records of every transaction, debt, and obligation. These ledgers were considered so valuable that the family employed armed guards specifically to protect them. Anyone who understood the contents of those books held the keys to power in eastern Kentucky. 6. The Sloan Mining Empire. While other families fought over territory or feuds, the Sloanes of Letcher County understood that true power lay beneath the earth. Beginning with patriarch Nathaniel Sloane in the 1890s, this clan didn't just extract coal from the mountains, they extracted the very soul of entire communities. Their mining operations became laboratories for human suffering, where accidents weren't mishaps, but carefully orchestrated reminders of who held life and death in their hands. Nathaniel's breakthrough came when he realized that desperate men would accept any working conditions if the alternative was starvation. The Sloane mines became notorious for safety violations that somehow never resulted in government intervention. Inspectors who arrived to investigate would find their reports mysteriously lost, their superiors suddenly reassigned, or their own families receiving visits from polite men who simply wanted to discuss workplace safety. What made the Sloanes uniquely terrifying was their use of company scrip instead of real wages. Workers received payment in Sloane currency that could only be spent at Sloane stores, creating a closed economic system that trapped entire families in perpetual debt. Children born into Sloane mining camps grew up never seeing actual money, never understanding that alternatives existed beyond the company's control. The family perfected what they called the rotation system. When miners became too sick or injured to work effectively, they weren't fired. They were transferred to surface duties, where their deteriorating condition served as a living warning to others. These walking casualties haunted the mining camps, their presence a constant reminder of what awaited those who couldn't maintain productivity. By the 1920s, the Sloanes controlled not just mines, but entire towns. They owned the houses where workers lived, the stores where they shopped, the schools where their children learned, and the cemeteries where they were buried. 3 generations of families lived and died without ever leaving Sloane property, creating a hereditary workforce that knew no other existence. Their most chilling innovation was the family accountability system. If one worker caused problems, his entire extended family faced consequences. Fathers watched their sons beaten for their own mistakes. Wives saw their husbands demoted for their brothers' infractions. The Sloanes had weaponized family loyalty, turning love into a tool of oppression. 7. The Pennington Trading Network. In the remote valleys of Bell County, the Pennington family built an empire that operated completely outside traditional commerce. Led by the shrewd Ezekiel Pennington, starting in the 1870s, they established trading posts that served as neutral ground for transactions that couldn't happen anywhere else. But neutrality came with prices that few understood until payment was demanded. The Penningtons dealt in everything that decent society rejected: stolen goods, forged documents, illegal weapons, and information that could destroy reputations or lives. Their trading posts functioned like embassies in hostile territory, where enemies could conduct business without fear of immediate violence. But every transaction created debts that the Penningtons collected with interest that compounded in blood. Ezekiel understood that in a lawless region, the person who provided essential services could dictate terms to everyone else. Need ammunition for a feud? The Penningtons could supply it, but they'd remember who bought what and when. Need to send a message to someone in another state? Their courier network was unmatched, but messages sometimes arrived with additional recipients. The family's true power lay in their ability to play all sides simultaneously. They sold weapons to feuding families, then sold information about weapon shipments to their enemies. They forged documents for fugitives, then sold those same fugitives' locations to bounty hunters. Their loyalty belonged only to profit, making them simultaneously indispensable and completely untrustworthy. Their trading posts developed reputations as places where anything could be obtained for the right price. Desperate people traveled hundreds of miles to reach Pennington establishments, knowing they offered services unavailable anywhere else. But the family's accounting system ensured that every customer eventually owed more than they could repay. The Penningtons maintained detailed records of every transaction, creating archives that read like encyclopedias of regional crime. They knew which judges could be bought, which sheriffs looked the other way, and which politicians had secrets worth protecting. This information became their most valuable commodity, traded carefully to maintain the delicate balance of power that kept them profitable. 8. The Combs Enforcement Network. While other families controlled territory or resources, the Combs clan of Perry County specialized in violence as a professional service. Beginning with the formidable Isaac Combs in the 1880s, they transformed revenge from a personal matter into a business enterprise. Need someone taught a lesson? The Combs could handle it. Want a problem to disappear permanently? Their rates were reasonable and their discretion absolute. Isaac's innovation was treating violence like any other skilled trade. His sons weren't just raised to be tough. They were trained in specific techniques for intimidation, interrogation, and elimination. Each family member developed specialties. Some excelled at psychological warfare, others at making deaths appear accidental, and a few at extracting information from reluctant sources. The Combs operated like a consulting firm for mountain justice. Clients would approach them with problems that couldn't be resolved through legal channels, and the family would provide solutions tailored to specific needs. Their services ranged from simple intimidation visits to complex operations that required months of planning and coordination. What made them particularly dangerous was their professional detachment. Unlike other families who killed from passion or revenge, the Combs approached violence with cold calculation. They studied their targets, identified weaknesses, and executed plans with surgical precision. Emotions didn't cloud their judgment because business was never personal. Their reputation for reliability made them indispensable to other criminal families throughout Kentucky. When the Hatfields needed to send a message to the McCoys, they hired Combs specialists. When corrupt politicians needed rivals eliminated, they contracted Combs' services. The family became the region's unofficial military contractor, providing violence as a commodity. The Combs maintained what they called the portfolio system, carefully balancing clients to avoid conflicts of interest. They never accepted contracts that would pit them against each other, and they never worked for free. Every service rendered created ongoing relationships that generated repeat business and referrals. 9. The Gibson Territory Wars. In the mountainous regions of Whitley County, the Gibson family turned territorial control into a science that would have impressed medieval warlords. Beginning with Patriarch Mordecai Gibson in the 1860s, they understood that controlling movement meant controlling everything else. The Gibsons didn't just own land, they owned the very concept of passage through their domain. Mordecai's breakthrough came when he realized that mountains created natural choke points that could be monitored and controlled. The Gibson territory included the only practical routes between several major valleys, making them unavoidable for travelers, merchants, and fugitives alike. They transformed geography into a weapon that generated income and intelligence simultaneously. The family established checkpoints disguised as helpful way stations where travelers could rest, resupply, and gather information about road conditions ahead. These stations functioned as intelligence-gathering posts where the Gibsons learned everything about everyone passing through their territory. Seemingly casual conversations revealed destinations, cargo contents, and personal relationships that became valuable commodities. Their enforcement methods relied heavily on psychological warfare rather than direct violence. Travelers who refused to pay passage fees would find themselves lost on mountain paths that had been clearly marked hours earlier. Signs would disappear, trails would be blocked by fallen trees, and helpful locals would suddenly speak only in incomprehensible dialects. The Gibsons perfected what they called graduated escalation. First-time offenders faced minor inconveniences that could be dismissed as bad luck. Repeat offenders discovered that their problems multiplied exponentially, culminating in encounters with armed men who offered final opportunities to reconsider their position on fees and respect. Their territory became a state within a state, complete with its own laws, currency, and judicial system. The Gibson Patriarch served as judge for disputes involving passage rights, trade disagreements, and territorial violations. His verdicts were final, and his enforcement methods were creative enough to serve as warnings to future offenders. 10. The Callahan Underground Railroad. Perhaps the most sophisticated of all Kentucky's criminal families, the Callahans of Johnson County operated what appeared to be legitimate businesses while running an underground network that moved people, goods, and information across state lines. Led by the brilliant Silas Callahan starting in the 1890s, they created an empire built on services that governments couldn't or wouldn't provide. Silas understood that America's rapid growth had created gaps in official authority that could be filled by private enterprise. The Callahans offered solutions for problems that decent people weren't supposed to have, moving fugitives to safety, laundering stolen goods, creating new identities, and facilitating communications between parties who couldn't be seen together publicly. Their network extended far beyond Kentucky's borders, reaching into Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Ohio. Callahan safe houses provided temporary shelter for people fleeing various forms of justice, while Callahan couriers carried messages and packages that couldn't trust official mail systems. They had created a shadow postal service for America's criminal underclass. The family's genius lay in their understanding that information was more valuable than any physical commodity. Every person who used their services provided intelligence about law enforcement activities, political developments, and criminal opportunities in distant locations. The Callahans assembled this information into comprehensive intelligence reports that they sold to various criminal organizations throughout the region. Their operations required unprecedented coordination and security. Family members used coded languages, maintained multiple identities, and operated under cover stories so elaborate that some forgot their real names. The Callahans had become professional criminals in an era when most crime was amateur and impulsive. What made them virtually impossible to prosecute was their careful separation between legal and illegal activities. On paper, they were successful merchants, innkeepers, and transportation contractors. Their criminal enterprises existed in the gaps between official transactions, making it nearly impossible for authorities to prove illegal activity without access to evidence that the family guarded more carefully than their own lives. The Callahan network survived well into the 1930s by constantly evolving their methods and expanding their reach. When Prohibition created new opportunities for profit, they seamlessly transitioned from moving fugitives to moving liquor. When the Great Depression destroyed legitimate businesses, desperate people turned to Callahan services in unprecedented numbers. They had built an empire that thrived on society's failures and grew stronger during times of crisis. But perhaps what made the Callahans most dangerous was their recruitment strategy. Unlike other families who relied on blood relatives, they actively sought out talented individuals with specific skills. Corrupt postal workers provided intelligence about federal investigations, dishonest bankers helped launder money, and crooked lawyers navigated legal complexities that could have destroyed lesser operations. The Callahans had created Kentucky's first professional criminal organization. Their downfall came not from law enforcement, but from their own success. By the 1940s, their network had grown so large and complex that maintaining security became impossible. Federal authorities, armed with new investigative techniques and unlimited resources, finally penetrated their operations. When the raids came, they were swift and devastating. The Callahan Empire collapsed in a single coordinated strike that netted over 200 arrests across 5 states. Yet even today, law enforcement officials in eastern Kentucky speak quietly about certain unsolved cases that bear hallmarks of Callahan methodology. Some believe remnants of their network survived, operating at smaller scales and maintaining the family's tradition of providing services that exist in the shadows between legal and illegal. These 10 families didn't just terrorize Kentucky, they rewrote the rules of how power worked in America's forgotten places. They proved that in regions where government authority was weak or absent, private individuals could create their own kingdoms built on fear, violence, and the willingness to do what others wouldn't. Their legacies stretched far beyond their own lifetimes, creating patterns of behavior that influenced criminal organizations throughout the Appalachian region for generations. What's most disturbing about these family dynasties isn't just their capacity for violence, but their sophistication in wielding power. They understood psychology, economics, and politics in ways that would have impressed Machiavelli. They created systems of control that were simultaneously brutal and efficient, turning entire communities into extensions of their will. The Cornets showed how methodical record-keeping could transform revenge into a science. The Fugits demonstrated that physical differences could become weapons of psychological warfare. The Stumbos proved that controlling elections meant controlling everything else. Each family contributed innovations to what became a regional curriculum in applied tyranny. Their influence extended far beyond Kentucky's borders. Criminal organizations throughout Appalachia studied and adopted techniques pioneered by these families. The methods they developed for controlling territory, gathering intelligence, and maintaining loyalty became standard practices for mountain criminals well into the modern era. Perhaps most chilling is how these families managed to operate for decades with minimal interference from legitimate authority. They succeeded because they understood that in isolated regions, people needed services that governments couldn't or wouldn't provide. They filled gaps in official authority with private systems that were often more efficient and reliable than legitimate alternatives. The Branhams turned feuding into an art form that claimed hundreds of lives across multiple generations. The Maggards created toll systems that controlled movement through entire regions. The Sloans trapped workers in economic systems that resembled slavery more than employment. Each family perfected different aspects of control, but all shared common understanding that power flows from the willingness to use it without restraint. Their recruitment methods reveal sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Rather than relying solely on fear, they offered membership in exclusive organizations that provided protection, purpose, and prosperity unavailable elsewhere. Young men with few prospects found themselves drawn into family operations that promised adventure and belonging in exchange for absolute loyalty. The territorial boundaries these families established often lasted longer than the families themselves. Even after violent ends claimed most original members, their geographic spheres of influence remained recognized by subsequent criminal organizations. Maps drawn in blood proved more durable than those drawn by government surveyors. Their economic innovations were equally lasting. Company script systems, pioneered by the Sloans, influenced labor practices throughout Appalachian mining regions. Toll systems developed by the Maggards became standard practice for controlling mountain passes. Intelligence networks created by the Callahans provided templates for organized crime throughout the eastern United States. The political machines they built demonstrated how democratic institutions could be corrupted and weaponized. The Stumbos showed that controlling voter registration meant controlling everything else. Their techniques for manipulating elections and intimidating opponents became standard practices for corrupt political organizations throughout rural America. Their enforcement methods revealed creativity that bordered on artistry. Rather than relying solely on killing enemies, they developed techniques for destroying them psychologically, economically, and socially. They understood that dead martyrs could inspire resistance, while broken men served as living warnings to others. The information systems they created were remarkably sophisticated for their era. Detailed record-keeping allowed them to track debts, favors, and obligations across decades. Intelligence networks provided early warning about law enforcement activities and political developments. Communication systems enabled coordination across vast territories without modern technology. Their survival strategies demonstrated remarkable adaptability. When civil authority grew stronger, they evolved from direct confrontation to subtle influence. When federal investigators arrived, they shifted operations to activities that were difficult to prosecute. When traditional criminal enterprises became too dangerous, they transitioned to legitimate businesses that provided cover for illegal activities. The psychological impact of these families extended far beyond their immediate victims. Entire communities lived under shadows cast by their reputations. Children grew up hearing whispered warnings about certain names and territories. Adults made life decisions based on avoiding conflicts with families whose vengeance could span generations. Their cultural influence persisted long after their criminal activities ended. Stories about their exploits became part of regional folklore, told and retold with mixture of fear and grudging admiration. They became symbols of what happened when civilization's restraints disappeared and raw human nature asserted itself without limitation. The legal systems they corrupted took decades to recover. Judges who had been compromised, sheriffs who had been bought, and politicians who had been intimidated created institutional weaknesses that persisted long after the families themselves were gone. Rebuilding trust in legitimate authority required generational change and constant vigilance. Their impact on federal law enforcement was equally significant. Agencies that had focused primarily on urban crime were forced to develop new techniques for investigating rural criminal organizations. The challenges these families presented led to innovations in surveillance, intelligence gathering, and interagency cooperation that influenced law enforcement practices nationwide. Perhaps most importantly, these families demonstrated the fragility of civilized society. They showed how quickly democratic institutions could be subverted when people were desperate enough to accept alternatives. Their success revealed weaknesses in American governance that took generations to address and arguably persist in modified forms today. The mountains that sheltered these families still stand, their hollows and ridges unchanged by the passage of time. But the communities they once terrorized have evolved, connected now to wider world through technology and transportation that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. The isolation that allowed these families to flourish has largely disappeared, replaced by connectivity that makes such concentrated power more difficult to achieve and maintain. Yet their stories serve as reminders of what lurks beneath society's civilized surface. In every community, in every era, there exist individuals capable of extraordinary violence, given sufficient motivation and opportunity. The families we've explored weren't monsters from another world. They were human beings who chose to embrace their darkest impulses and build empires on the suffering of others. Their legacies force uncomfortable questions about human nature and social organization. How thin is the veneer of civilization that separates ordered society from chaos? What conditions allow individuals to accumulate power that rivals or exceeds legitimate government? How do communities recover from generational trauma inflicted by those who were supposed to be neighbors and protectors? These 10 Kentucky families terrorized entire generations, leaving scars that persisted long after their reigns ended. They proved that in America's forgotten places, where law was distant and authority was weak, determined individuals could create kingdoms built on blood and maintained through fear. Their stories aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings about what happens when civilization fails and human nature asserts itself without restraint. The echoes of these family dynasties didn't simply fade when their original members died or fled. Instead, their methods evolved, adapted, and found new expressions in Kentucky's changing landscape. As coal mining expanded in the early 1900s as railroads penetrated deeper into mountain valleys, as federal authorities slowly extended its reach into previously forgotten territories. The techniques these families had perfected found new practitioners and new applications. What's most disturbing isn't just the violence these clans inflicted, but how their innovations in control and intimidation became part of the region's cultural DNA. Children who grew up hearing stories about the Cornet's accounting system later applied similar record-keeping methods to their own disputes. Young men who witnessed the Maggards' toll operations established their own checkpoints on different roads decades later. The lessons these families taught through terror became generational knowledge, passed down like family recipes. The geographic territories they carved out often remained contested long after their creators were gone. Mountain passes that the Gibsons had controlled became battlegrounds for subsequent criminal organizations. Mining camps where the Sloans had operated became focal points for labor disputes that turned violent with disturbing frequency. The boundaries drawn in blood proved remarkably persistent, influencing criminal activity patterns well into the modern era. Law enforcement officials who finally managed to penetrate these family strongholds discovered something that challenged their understanding of rural crime. These weren't simple gangs or loosely organized criminal groups. They found sophisticated organizational structures that resembled businesses more than traditional criminal enterprises. The Callahans had maintained personnel files on their associates. The Penningtons had detailed inventory systems for their illegal goods. The Stumbos had voting records that revealed election manipulation strategies spanning multiple decades. Federal investigators who arrived expecting to find crude mountain criminals instead encountered operations that displayed remarkable intelligence and forward thinking. The families had anticipated government expansion into their territories and had prepared accordingly. Safe houses were located beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement. Communication networks could relay warnings faster than officers could travel. Financial systems allowed rapid liquidation of assets before raids could seize them. The psychological profiles developed by early criminologists who studied these families revealed patterns that would later influence understanding of organized crime throughout America. These weren't individuals driven by passion or desperation. They were calculating predators who had identified systematic weaknesses in American governance and had built empires by exploiting those weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. Their recruitment methods demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human motivation that wouldn't have seemed out of place in modern corporate training programs. They identified individuals with specific skills and temperaments, offered them opportunities unavailable through legitimate channels, and created loyalty through combination of reward and consequence that bound associates to the family more effectively than blood relationships. The Branhams had perfected techniques for identifying young men with violent potential and channeling that violence toward family objectives. The Gibsons had developed systems for recognizing individuals with natural intelligence gathering abilities and training them in surveillance techniques. Each family had become specialized in human resource management for criminal enterprises. Their financial innovations were equally sophisticated. The Sloans had created closed economic systems that trapped entire communities in perpetual debt while generating consistent profits for family operations. The Penningtons had developed currency exchange systems that allowed conversion of stolen goods into legitimate wealth through complex trading networks. They had solved problems that wouldn't be formally addressed by legitimate businesses for decades. The political machines they constructed revealed understanding of democratic processes that impressed even their enemies. The Stumbos had identified key pressure points in electoral systems and had developed techniques for influencing outcomes without leaving evidence that could support prosecutions. Their methods for controlling voter registration, manipulating ballot counting, and intimidating opposition candidates became textbook examples of political corruption. But perhaps their most lasting innovation was their approach to information warfare. Long before anyone used terms like intelligence gathering or psychological operations, these families had developed systematic approaches to collecting, analyzing, and weaponizing information about their enemies and communities. They understood that knowledge was power in ways that wouldn't be formally recognized until modern intelligence agencies adopted similar techniques. The Callahans had created information networks that rivaled official government intelligence systems. Their couriers carried more than messages. They gathered intelligence about law enforcement activities, political developments, and economic opportunities across multiple states. This information was analyzed, categorized, and distributed to family associates in ways that provided strategic advantages over competitors and enemies alike. Their surveillance techniques were remarkably advanced for their era. Family members learned to observe without being observed, to remember details that others overlooked, and to recognize patterns that revealed weaknesses in enemy operations. They developed codes and signals that allowed communication in situations where open conversation would have been dangerous. The psychological warfare they waged against communities was equally sophisticated. Rather than relying solely on direct intimidation, they created atmospheres of uncertainty and fear that proved more effective than threats. People never knew when they might be watched, when their activities might be reported, or when past indiscretions might be used against them. Their understanding of human psychology allowed them to identify and exploit individual weaknesses with surgical precision. They knew which community leaders could be bought, which could be intimidated, and which had to be eliminated. They understood that controlling key individuals often meant controlling entire communities without need for widespread violence. The economic systems they created demonstrated remarkable innovation in what would later be recognized as behavioral economics. They understood how to structure incentives that encouraged desired behavior while making resistance seem futile. Their company stores didn't just sell goods, they created dependencies that made escape from family control nearly impossible. Their credit systems trapped individuals and families in cycles of debt that could persist across generations. But these weren't simple loan shark operations. They were sophisticated financial instruments that created long-term obligations while providing short-term benefits that made initial agreements seem attractive. The legal strategies they employed revealed understanding of American jurisprudence that impressed attorneys who later studied their methods. They knew how to exploit procedural requirements, jurisdictional limitations, and evidentiary standards that could neutralize prosecutions even when their guilt was obvious. They had learned to weaponize the very legal system that was supposed to protect society from their predations. Their corruption of public officials wasn't crude bribery, but sophisticated compromise operations that created long-term control over key individuals. They understood that officials who could be bought today might refuse payment tomorrow, but officials who had been compromised through carefully documented criminal activity would remain loyal indefinitely. The infrastructure they built to support their operations was remarkably durable. Safe houses constructed by the Maggards were still being used by criminal organizations decades after the original family was gone. Communication networks established by the Gibsons continued to function long after their creators had died or fled. They had built criminal infrastructure that outlasted the criminals who created it. Their weapons caches were discovered years after their defeat, hidden in locations that revealed sophisticated understanding of military strategy and logistics. They had prepared for extended conflicts with government forces and had stockpiled equipment that could have supported guerrilla warfare campaigns lasting months or years. The training programs they developed for family members and associates were remarkably comprehensive. Young recruits learned not just violence, but also intelligence gathering, financial management, political manipulation, and psychological warfare. They had created criminal academies that produced graduates capable of operating independently while maintaining loyalty to family objectives. Their internal discipline systems were equally sophisticated. Rather than ruling through arbitrary violence, they had developed codes of conduct and punishment systems that created predictable consequences for various infractions. This predictability made their organizations more stable and effective than criminal groups that relied solely on fear and intimidation. The record-keeping systems they maintained were so detailed that historians studying their operations decades later could reconstruct their activities with remarkable precision. But these records weren't just historical artifacts. They were operational tools that allowed families to track obligations, plan operations, and maintain control over complex criminal enterprises. Their succession planning revealed understanding of organizational continuity that wouldn't have seemed out of place in legitimate businesses. They had developed systems for transferring leadership, maintaining institutional knowledge, and preserving operational capabilities across generational transitions. They had built criminal dynasties designed to survive the deaths or imprisonment of key individuals. The cultural impact of these families extended far beyond their immediate criminal activities. They had changed how entire communities understood power, authority, and justice. Generations grew up believing that official law enforcement was weak and corrupt, while private family justice was swift and certain. Their influence on regional politics persisted long after their criminal enterprises ended. Electoral patterns, voting behaviors, and political loyalties established during their reigns continued to influence Kentucky politics for decades. They had created political cultures that proved remarkably resistant to reform efforts. The economic development of their territories was permanently altered by their activities. Regions that had been controlled by criminal families often struggled to attract legitimate businesses or government investment. The reputation for lawlessness they had created became self-perpetuating, discouraging economic development that might have improved living conditions and reduced criminal activity. Their impact on social trust was equally lasting. Communities that had lived under family control often developed cultures of suspicion and secrecy that persisted long after the original threats were gone. People learned not to trust authorities, not to cooperate with investigations, and not to expect protection from official sources. The folklore that developed around these families revealed complicated community attitudes toward their criminal activities. While people feared their violence, they sometimes admired their effectiveness. Stories about family exploits often contained elements of grudging respect for their intelligence, organization, and success in challenging government authority. Their techniques for maintaining loyalty created patterns of behavior that influenced legitimate organizations throughout the region. Businesses, churches, and political groups adopted modified versions of family methods for building commitment and preventing defection. The boundary between criminal and legitimate organizational techniques became blurred in ways that persist today. The investigation techniques developed to combat these families influenced law enforcement practices throughout America. Federal agencies learned to coordinate across jurisdictions, to penetrate closed communities, and to prosecute complex criminal organizations. The challenges these families presented led to innovations that proved valuable in combating organized crime in urban areas. Their defeat required unprecedented cooperation between federal, state, and local authorities. The investigation and prosecution efforts that finally brought them down became models for subsequent operations against organized crime. But success came at enormous cost in time, resources, and personnel that revealed just how formidable these families had become. The trials that followed their capture revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprises to communities that had lived under their control but had never understood the complete picture. Testimony from former associates, evidence from seized records, and victim statements painted portraits of criminal organizations that had achieved levels of sophistication that shocked even experienced prosecutors. The sentences handed down to family members who survived to face justice were among the harshest in Kentucky legal history. But even lengthy prison terms couldn't fully address the damage they had inflicted on their communities. The social, economic, and political wounds they had created required generational healing that continued long after their criminal careers ended. Their stories became cautionary tales told to warn subsequent generations about the dangers of allowing criminal organizations to establish territorial control. But they also became inspiration for some individuals who admired their success in challenging government authority and building independent power bases. The academic study of these families contributed to developing understanding of organized crime, rural criminality, and the relationship between isolation and lawlessness. Sociologists, criminologists, and historians who analyzed their methods provided insights that influenced both law enforcement strategies and social policy throughout Appalachian regions. Their legacy raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of authority and the sources of political legitimacy. In territories where government presence was weak, these families had provided services that people needed: dispute resolution, economic opportunity, protection from other threats. Their criminal methods were inexcusable, but their success revealed genuine weaknesses in official governance that took decades to address. The transformation of their former territories into more conventional communities required massive investment in law enforcement, education, and economic development. Government programs designed to prevent the emergence of similar criminal organizations became permanent features of federal policy in rural areas throughout America. Today, the mountains where these families once ruled remain largely peaceful, their communities connected to the wider world through technology and transportation that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. But their stories serve as reminders of how quickly civilized society can collapse when authority fails and determined individuals choose to build empires on the suffering of others. The 10 Kentucky families that terrorized entire generations didn't just commit crimes, they created alternative systems of power that challenged the fundamental assumptions of democratic governance. Their success revealed vulnerabilities in American society that persist in different forms today, making their stories not just historical curiosities, but warnings about the eternal struggle between civilization and chaos.